Machiavelli has had an enormous impact on Western political thought. Part of that impact has been a modern fascination with the concept of the citizen soldier, and a corresponding detestation and excoriation of mercenaries. In his most famous book, The Prince, Machiavelli makes the following statement against mercenaries. Mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous, and if one holds his state based on these arms, he will stand neither firm nor safe, for they are disunited, ambitious, and without discipline, unfaithful, valiant before friends, cowardly before enemies. They have neither the fear of God nor fidelity to men, and destruction is deferred only so long as the attack is. For in peace one is robbed by them, and in war by the enemy. He continues his argument by stating that mercenary captains are dangerous to the freedom of an independent state. He argues that this danger comes from two directions. First, ambitious mercenary captains, and second, unambitious mercenary captains. Machiavelli argues that an ambitious officer is dangerous to the state because he will eventually try to take that state over, while an unambitious man will fail as an officer and fail the state in battle. Second, he provides examples of three nations that succeeded in avoiding subjugation by foreign powers for extended periods of time. These nations are Rome, Sparta, and Switzerland. Each of these states had a strong tradition of citizen soldier infantry fighting for them. Third, he provides the negative example of Carthage. After the First Punic War, the mercenaries under Carthage's employ turned against their masters, and in Machiavelli's words, oppressed them. His fourth example is of a mercenary commander who betrayed his oaths to the city of Milan, and in fact took over the city that he had been hired to protect. He then provides a counter-argument against what he expects his opposition to put forward. He expects his opposition to point to previous mercenary captains who had faithfully served Venice or Florence. He continues to bring up the possibility of a mercenary taking over the city that he was hired to protect. He admits that this had not happened with two of Florence's most famous mercenaries, but he says that it could have happened, and that the people would not have done anything about it had happened. For Florence, he argues that the Venetians assassinating one of their mercenary commanders was the correct piece of statecraft, and that the loss of the Battle of Vallia can be attributed to mercenaries, and that this ruined 800 years of Venetian gain. He then gives the following polemic, which I will give in full. The principle that has guided them has been, first, to lower the credit of infantry so that they might increase their own. They did this because, subsisting on their pay, and without territory, they were unable to support many soldiers, and a few infantry did not give them any authority. So they were led to employ cavalry, with a moderate force of which they were maintained and honored, and affairs were brought to such a pass that, in an army of 20,000 soldiers, there were not to be found 2,000 foot soldiers. They had, besides this, used every art to lessen fatigue and danger to themselves and their soldiers, not killing in the fray, but taking prisoners and liberating without ransom. They did not attack towns at night, nor did the garrisons of the towns attack encampments at night. They did not surround the camp either with stockade or ditch, nor did they campaign in the winter. All these things were permitted by their military rules, and devised by them to avoid, as I have said, both fatigue and dangers. Thus they have brought Italy to slavery and contempt. I wish also to recall to memory an instance from the Old Testament applicable to this subject. David offered himself to Saul to fight with Goliath, the Philistine champion, and, to give him courage, Saul armed him with his own weapons, which David rejected as soon as he had them on his back, saying he could make no use of them, and that he wished to meet the enemy with his sling and his knife. Further, in Chapter 7 of the history of Florence and of the affairs of Italy, Machiavelli states about one battle that, "Nor was there ever an instance of wars being carried on in an enemy's country with less injury to the assailants than this. For in so great a defeat, and in a battle which continued 4 hours, only one man died, and he not from wounds inflicted by hostile weapons, nor any honorable means, but, having fallen from his horse, was trampled to death. combatants then engaged with little danger, being nearly all mounted, covered with armor, and preserved from death whenever they chose to surrender. There was no necessity for risking their lives. While fighting, their armor defended them, and when they could no longer resist, they yielded and were safe. So, what are the lessons that we think we can learn from a direct reading of these texts? Machiavelli posits that 1. Mercenaries are inherently worse than native-born troops. 2. That mercenaries are transcendentally inferior to citizen soldiers given their money-based motivations. 3. Mercenaries are more likely to be dangerous and mutinous to political power than local troops are. 4. Locally grown, centrally loyal troops provide superior fighting power to all other kinds of troops. 5. Mercenaries are lazy. 6. Italy is lost to foreigners on account of mercenaries' moral and spiritual failure. But we must ask ourselves, is this an accurate reading of history? We must take into account key considerations about Machiavelli's biases. Perhaps most important, Machiavelli was what we could call a Romophile. That is, he is fascinated by everything Roman, and especially the concepts from the Roman Republican era. So, of course, he is fascinated with the Roman method of recruiting troops. This, when contrasted with Italy's combined collective military power, led him to pin the blame on the method of recruitment, that is, hiring mercenaries instead of collecting citizen soldiers from the countryside. Second, it is important to remember that Machiavelli came from the city of Florence, and that Florence was perhaps the worst client state for a mercenary to hire themselves out to. Florence generally did not offer bonuses for good service as many of the other Italian city-states offered, and had a comparatively ineffective supply system. These factors conspired to make the city a last resort for a mercenary to choose to be employed by. Thus, it would make sense for Machiavelli to have not seen the best mercenaries in his own personal life. Third, it should be remembered that Machiavelli is deeply disturbed by the fact that Italy is occupied by the Spanish and the French forces. This began with the French invasion of Italy in 1494. This gives Machiavelli a deep emotional distrust of mercenaries, as he perceives them as a major cause of the fall of Italy to foreign occupation. I will now present a list of rebuttals to Machiavelli's claim. All military appointments can become dangerous if the troops are ill-satisfied. This isn't just a function of mercenaries. This is just military troops in general. It's a function of force. If someone with sufficient force becomes ill-satisfied with the current setup of things, they can attempt to use that force to rearrange the existing political structures. And secondly, Machiavelli makes a mistake in linking ambition to competence. That isn't a one-for-one trade-off. There's been a number of people who've been enormously ambitious who have also been deeply incompetent, and I think you can think of examples of that on your own. In answer to his second point of giving three states that hold out really well, Rome, Switzerland, Sparta, those are very good choices. What he doesn't tell you, though, is he tried to do this. He tried to set up an army of citizen soldiers, and they failed him, and that's why he's no longer in government and why he actually has the time to write. So to go back to his third example from the Prince, Carthage had stopped paying a very large number of men at their capital, and then they tried to placate them by paying small amounts, until eventually the mercenaries rise up and revolt against the capital and attempt to overthrow it. They don't succeed, they're put down eventually, but, as he says, they oppressed the Carthaginians for a while. One of the historians from the time considers this the most vicious war in history. And comparable things have happened, though, with national armies. The Habsburg Spanish troops in the second half of the 1500s mutiny over 70 times because they're not paid enough. Similar things happened with the American veterans after World War I in the 30s. They attempt to occupy Washington, D.C. and force legislators to pay them what they expected to be paid. This, didn't work. It's an example of national citizen soldiers, his wording, essentially going rogue and trying to do, in a slightly more polite method, but trying to force the government to pay them, which is essentially what the Carthaginians were doing up until a point. Further, there is, of course, examples of mercenaries being used highly successfully in Carthage even. Most famously, Hannibal. He uses an army of mercenaries and almost breaks Rome, and Rome at this time has its citizen soldiers at what would be considered by people who like that concept at one of the best eras for Rome, really. And then to go back to his fourth example of the traitor guy from Milan who goes and takes over Milan despite, just being hired to work. I'll give him that, but that's a singular example. And he tries to make that out as though it's the common happenstance. That really doesn't seem to be the case from the evidence, even in Italy, or maybe even especially in Italy. The mercenaries that was pretty rare because the mercenaries would value their reputation. Because, you hurt your employer, obviously they're going to spread the bad news about you. And obviously no one is going to be hiring you if you're just proven untrustworthy. It's just deeply unlikely that most of them would try to take over from the people who are hiring them. So his fifth example, he's trying to counter an argument on how Florence and Venice were doing. As I've already said, Florence treated their troops really badly. They were bad employers. So this results due to the simple rules of econ, just getting the worst troops. They're not paying very well, so they're getting the most desperate, who you would expect to be, ones who aren't being, you might say, headhunted by the more successful countries. And so then his counterfactual saying, these two mercenary captains could have taken over Venice and there's nothing people would have done to stop them. It just seems kind of pointless because, one of those guys, he serves for 20 years with quite a bit of distinction. He never tries to take over. Florence bends over backwards to keep him, which is incidentally the one time they actually treat one of the mercenaries right, and he in turn serves them quite successfully. It just seems to be Machiavelli smearing people who are better than him militarily. And then in Venice, he talks about the Venetian politics where they assassinate someone. Well, that happens quite a bit in Venetian politics, and it hardly seems like you would build political theory for every prince in every age based on what the Venetians did. It hardly seems appropriate to take one case and then make it a rule all statesmen should follow on the entire topic. So now let's work through one of his longer paragraphs. He begins by discrediting the mercenaries for not having a higher proportion of infantry in their ranks. This criticism can be traced back to his view of Roman infantry. This criticism might be fair in a military sense. It seems flawed, though, given the voluntary nature of the companies. The individuals in the mercenary companies, due to the romanticization of cavalry, wanted to be cavalry. This is not just the fault of the mercenaries so much as the whole societal push in Europe at the time. If you go into battle, do you want to be on a horse in armor and riding out in the front and having a chance at glory and honor, or slogging it out with a mace or halberd in the back line? It's just not really comparable to a lot of these people who'd be going into it, at least partly for glory. Even in the mercenaries, you can tell from their writing that that's one of the things they're after. He then makes a bizarre and frankly bloodthirsty complaint against mercenaries for not killing everyone they run across on the battlefield. In the same sentence, he complains about them releasing prisoners without taking ransom from those prisoners. Both of these arguments could be made on grounds of efficiency and obedience of orders, but it's just a weird contrast with how heavily he has this assumed moral position. He's like, what? They're not killing everyone they run across? They're having mercy on the battlefield? What is this? It's just weird because he's acting like, oh wow, mercenaries, they're just so evil. He then criticizes the mercenaries for not doing night attacks. This, of course, is at a textbook level. It sounds like they're just perfect cowards, but it does not really take into account the dangers of a night attack. Even a successful night attack with successful surprise is still quite dangerous to the attackers. This can be exacerbated by non-standard uniforms. If you're wearing armor, and then the guys on the other side are wearing essentially the same armor, or essentially the same clothes, it's easy to have people running into each other and killing each other. It's in the dark. It's not like everyone's color-coded, and there's quite a bit of confusion in a battle ordinarily in daylight, even when you're all formed up. And that confusion can get worse if you're attacking under cover of darkness. One of the big incentives for people at that time is, I want to be seen doing something brave. You can't really be seen doing something brave if you go in at night. That's just kind of how our eyes work. It's just very, very dangerous. Go die for me at night. Nobody will see you. No one will know who you are. You'll die in the mud. But you'll have won a battle. Further, he criticizes the mercenaries for not building stockades around their camps every night. This is, of course, another blatant appeal to Roman army doctrine. Again, this has the appearance of intelligence, but trenches and stocks are not an unmitigated good. The Roman advantages of trenches and stockades can largely be managed by scouting and paying attention to the enemy. You don't have to form a camp every night. It was useful to the Romans, but one reason it is a lot of the times they just didn't scout correctly. So the Roman advantage of stockades can largely be managed by scouting and paying attention to the enemy, while trenches can pin a force. Further, note that the men who went to war and formed the bulk of the mercenary captains would have resisted being turned into shovel wielders. No, they didn't go to war to do physical labor. It would be roughly 200 years before large-scale field work start coming back into the field, and that's partly because you just have bigger armies, and you have a bigger reason. Again, if he's so right about the armor being making them too safe, which is just such an absurd attack. If he's right about that, why do they need trenches? He then gives an attack on the mercenaries for not campaigning in the winter, which is strange. The mercenaries wanted to be hired in the winter, but the city-states generally would not hire them, except in the spring or summer. It's because the states themselves didn't declare war usually in the winter. War would be fought in the summer when there was an abundance of food, because if you fight in the winter, the logistical strain would just be too much. And for what? You're going to go up to another castle and then try to lay siege them in the winter? That's just unrealistic. They have all the food from the recent farming, and there's no tactics, there's no strategy to it. It's just lay siege and try to starve them out, which is costly. He concludes the paragraph with an accusation that it is the laziness and the cowardliness of the mercenaries that caused Italy to be conquered and, quote, enslaved. If the mercenaries had been defeated by a failed night attack, or from not building a fortified camp, or had the French invaded in the winter and beat their enemies because of, the Italians not being used to fighting in winter weather, or had the mercenary companies just scattered in a massive rout in the face of the French, these statements would have weight, but these things did not happen. Now we come up to Machiavelli's analysis of the Old Testament, where he thinks about what David has done and all that. And here he makes a few mistakes. He says David goes up with a sling and a knife. It isn't that. David goes up with a staff and a sling. The cutting business comes from Goliath's sword afterwards. But here he's trying to make an analogy, and like most analogies, he fails. Because the reason David doesn't use the sword and the armor is not because he's saying that sword and armor are just inefficient as tools and unusable. David is saying, I can't use these because I haven't tested them properly. Which implies that, yes, Saul, I would use these weapons if only I've tested them. So now we come back to Machiavelli in that battle that he was talking about earlier, where he acts as though the mercenaries are just, playing it cool, being safe, and one of the guys dies purely accidentally. And the idea he seems to be going for is that really the mercenaries, they go, they hire themselves out, and then they come and meet each other on the field, and then have some kind of elaborate interpretive dance with weapons, where really it's not a battle, but it's just making it look like one so they can keep fleecing money off of their employers. And that's kind of the image he seems to be going for. But this just isn't borne out by the facts. The battle he talks about where he claims only one guy dies in the mud from falling off his horse, according to other accounts, that's one of the hardest fought battles in Italian history up until that point. And over 900 people die on both sides, which just makes me think he's lying, for his own political ends, because he's trying very hard to push his point. You can imagine Machiavelli as a political officer forcing his troops to march into battle in formation, not wear any personal armor, go in, attack at night, and all the confusion that'll bring. Don't take any prisoners, kill everyone you come across. It's not your job to reason why what you're doing. Just go in and kill the enemy. No mercy, no consideration for your own survival, just die for the state. So what are the results of just accepting Machiavelli's view of mercenaries? First, I would say it leads to a centralization of power. So why is this? It's a basic tenet of economics that the larger number of sellers you have for a product in large supply, the cheaper it will be to purchase, making it so that the price of hiring soldiers would be largely set by the government, makes professional soldiers with independent thought a rare breed and the mass soldier the majority. This leads to an emphasis on mass infantry armies. And a subpoint to this, the more troops there are on a battlefield, the higher you have chances of mass casualties occurring. If there's only 500 guys there, you can't have mass casualties. The second subpoint, mass, unarmored, drafted or conscripted infantry units, as were common after Machiavelli's writing, had a huge chance of being killed or injured without any hope of decent remuneration. Third, conscription of the citizen soldier. The wars of the 18th through 20th centuries were fought on a large scale, and in many of the European countries, drafts or conscriptions were imposed on the able-bodied male populations to force them to fight for the whims of the ruling elites. This could legitimately be called a form of short-term slavery. Further, in many cases it had a higher mortality rate than the transatlantic slave trade. Really, the question you should ask is it more noble to die for money of your own free will, or to die in the trenches so you aren't shot by your own side? To return to David and Saul's armor, there are a number of lessons that Machiavelli could have justly derived from his example for an Italian prince. For example, in matters of life and death, do not rely on things you do not understand at an experiential level. A lesson the Florentines could have used when Machiavelli had been in the post of power. To return to Scripture, Jesus said, "The laborer is worthy of his hire." It seems to me that if there was any job you would want to be well remunerated for, it would be risking life or limb for some Machiavellian prince.